It is the early morning hours of October 30th, 1955. In the ultra-exclusive enclave of Oyster Bay, Long Island, the wealthiest families in America are fast asleep behind locked gates and velvet curtains. Here, inside the sprawling 60-room estates of the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, and the Woodwards, money is the ultimate shield. It protects you from poverty. It protects you from consequence. It protects you from the real world. But money cannot stop a bullet. When the police arrived at the Woodward estate that autumn night, they found William Woodward Jr., the handsome, 35-year-old heir to one of America's greatest banking fortunes, lying dead in the upstairs hallway. His chest had been torn apart by a double-barreled shotgun. Kneeling beside him, covered in his blood, sobbing uncontrollably, was his wife, Ann Woodward. She told the police a terrifying story. She said there was a prowler in the house. She said she woke up in the dark, heard footsteps in the hallway, grabbed her hunting rifle, and fired into the shadows. She thought she was killing an intruder. Instead, she killed the golden boy of American high society. Beloved viewer, welcome to another educational video on the history of the elites. If this is your first time here, comment below where you're watching from, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on our future videos. The police called it a tragic accident. The coroner ruled it a mistake. But the glittering, ruthless world of New York's elite called it something else entirely. They called it murder. To the blue-blooded aristocracy of Fifth Avenue, Ann Woodward was never one of them. She was an outsider. A small-town girl from Kansas who had clawed her way up from the gritty stages of Broadway nightclubs into the highest ranks of society. They had always whispered that she was a gold digger. Now, they whispered that she was an executioner. The scandal would become the obsession of the century. It would inspire books, tear families apart, and eventually catch the eye of the infamous writer Truman Capote, who would use his sharp pen to seal Ann's ultimate destruction. This is the story of Ann Woodward. It is a story of dazzling ambition, intoxicating wealth, dark secrets, and the deadly price one woman paid for trying to belong in a world that never wanted her. To understand the tragedy of Ann Woodward, you have to understand the desperation of her beginning. Before the mansions, before the diamonds, and before the scandal, she was Evangeline Lucille Crowell. Born in 1915 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, Evangeline grew up in a world where money was scarce and dreams were luxuries. Her childhood was marked by instability. Her parents divorced when she was young, a major stigma at the time, and her mother relocated them to Kansas City. From a very early age, Evangeline realized two things. First, that poverty was a prison. And second, that she had been blessed with the single key that could unlock the door to freedom, breathtaking beauty. Evangeline was ambitious, hungry, and fiercely intelligent. She looked at the dusty plains of the Midwest and knew she was meant for bigger things. In 1937, at the age of 22, she packed her bags, boarded a train, and left Evangeline Crowell behind forever. When she stepped off the train at Grand Central Terminal in New York City, she had a new name, a new identity, and a new mission. She was now Ann Eden, and she was going to conquer New York. New York City in the late 1930s was a playground for the rich and a battlefield for the ambitious. Ann Eden threw herself into the fray. She took lessons to erase her Midwestern accent, adopting a smooth, cultured tone. She worked as a model, her face appearing in commercial advertisements and catalogs. She even landed small roles in radio dramas. But Ann knew that if she wanted to meet the men who truly held power in the city, she needed to be where they spent their money. She became a showgirl at the famed Copacabana nightclub. The Copacabana was the epicenter of New York nightlife. Every evening, Wall Street bankers, Broadway producers, politicians, and heirs to massive fortunes gathered there to drink, make deals, and admire the beautiful women on stage. Ann was not just another showgirl, she was observant. She studied how the wealthy talked, how they dressed, and what they valued. She was looking for a ticket out of the working class, and in the spring of 1941, that ticket walked through the doors of the nightclub. His name was William Woodward Jr. Everyone called him Billy. Billy Woodward was the absolute embodiment of American royalty. He was the only son of William Woodward Sr., the chairman of the massive Hanover National Bank. The Woodward family was incredibly wealthy, boasting a lineage that traced back to colonial America. They owned estates in New York, mansions in London, and the legendary Bel Air Stud Farm in Maryland, which produced Kentucky Derby-winning racehorses. Billy was tall, athletic, educated at Harvard, and served as an officer in the United States Navy. He was the most eligible bachelor in America. When Billy saw Ann Eden at the Copacabana, he was instantly captivated by her striking beauty and vivacious charm. The attraction was electric. For Billy, Ann was exciting, passionate, and entirely different from the sheltered, polite debutantes he had grown up with. For Ann, Billy was everything she had ever dreamed of. He was kind, handsome, and held the keys to a kingdom she desperately wanted to enter. But there was a massive obstacle standing in their way, an obstacle named Elsie Woodward. Elsie Woodward was the matriarch of the Woodward family, and one of the most powerful women in New York high society. She was a woman who ruled her social circle with an iron fist. To Elsie, society was a fortress, and marriage was a business transaction meant to merge fortunes and preserve bloodlines. When Billy announced that he was dating a radio actress and former nightclub dancer from Kansas, Elsie was horrified. She viewed Ann as an absolute opportunist, an uncultured gold digger, trying to steal her son and her family's prestige. Elsie used every ounce of her influence to stop the relationship. She introduced Billy to wealthy heiresses, threatened to cut him off, and made it clear that Ann would never be accepted into the family. But Billy was headstrong. For the first time in his life, he defied his mother. In March 1943, Billy and Ann were married in a quiet ceremony in Washington, D.C. Ann Eden, the little girl from Pittsburgh, Kansas, had achieved the impossible. She was now Mrs. William Woodward Jr. She had the title, she had the wealth, and she had the ring. But she was about to learn a very painful lesson. In the world of the elite, getting inside the palace is only half the battle. Surviving the palace is another thing entirely. Following their wedding, Billy and Ann moved into the highest stratosphere of American life. They had a luxurious townhouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a sprawling country estate in Oyster Bay named Pratt Oval, and access to millions of dollars. They soon welcomed two sons, William III and James. On paper, Ann had the perfect life, but in reality, she was living in a gilded cage. New York high society followed Elsie Woodward's lead. Because Elsie despised Ann, the rest of the elite treated Ann with freezing politeness. At charity galas, dinner parties, and exclusive polo matches, Ann was subtly shunned. The women mocked her clothes, her background, and her eagerness to please. They whispered behind their fans that she was vulgar. Ann tried desperately to fit in. She bought the finest Parisian haute couture. She studied art and literature. She threw lavish parties. But the harder she tried, the more society pushed her away. As the years passed, the cracks in the Woodward marriage began to show. Billy, who had once been so enchanted by Ann's fire, began to tire of her constant anxiety and social insecurity. He was a man who loved sports, horse racing, and the quiet confidence of old money. Ann was high-strung, demanding, and constantly fighting for respect. Billy began to spend more time away from home. He immersed himself in the family's horse racing business. In 1955, his horse Nashua won the Preakness Stakes and the Belmont Stakes, making Billy the toast of the sporting world. With his rising fame came the inevitable temptations. Rumors began to swirl that Billy was having affairs with other women who came from his own social class. Ann was consumed by jealousy and paranoia. She knew that if Billy divorced her, she would lose everything. Elsie Woodward would ensure that Ann was cast out of society with nothing, stripped of her status and perhaps even her children. The atmosphere inside the Woodward homes became incredibly toxic. There were screaming matches, slammed doors, and heavy drinking. By the autumn of 1955, Ann Woodward was a woman pushed to the absolute edge. Her nerves were frayed, her marriage was collapsing. And to make matters worse, a very real, physical danger was stalking the wealthy estates of Long Island. In October 1955, the wealthy residents of Oyster Bay were in a state of panic. A brazen cat burglar had been targeting the grand estates along the North Shore. This prowler was slipping into mansions in the dead of night, stealing jewelry and cash while the homeowners slept. Billy and Ann Woodward were terrified of the prowler. Just weeks earlier, during a rainstorm, someone had attempted to break into their home. In response, Billy and Ann did what many wealthy Americans did at the time. They armed themselves. they kept loaded shotguns and rifles in their respective bedrooms. This atmosphere of fear set the stage for the darkest night of their lives. On the evening of October 29th, 1955, Billy and Ann attended a dinner party hosted by Florence Pritchett, a prominent socialite. Guests at the party later noted that the Woodwards seemed tense. There was a quiet friction between them. During the dinner, the conversation turned to the neighborhood prowler. Ann was reportedly vocal about her terror, stating that she kept a gun by her bed and wouldn't hesitate to use it. Around 1 a.m. on October 30th, the couple returned home to their estate in Oyster Bay. They dismissed the servants, locked the doors, and went upstairs to sleep. Because of their marital strain, Billy and Ann slept in separate bedrooms across a long, dark hallway from one another. What happened over the next 2 hours remains one of the most hotly debated mysteries in American criminal history. According to Ann's official statement to police, she awoke around 2:15 a.m. Her pet dog was barking frantically in the downstairs foyer. Ann sat up in bed. The house was pitch black. She listened intently and heard what sounded like footsteps moving in the hallway just outside her bedroom door. Panic seized her. She was convinced the prowler had returned. Ann reached into her closet and grabbed her customized 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun. Trembling in the dark, she crept to the doorway of her bedroom. She looked out into the shadowy hallway. About 10 feet away, she saw a tall shadow standing near Billy's bedroom door. Ann raised the shotgun. She didn't call out. She didn't ask who was there. She pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the massive house. Ann turned on the lights, expecting to see a masked burglar lying on the floor. Instead, she looked down and saw her husband, Billy Woodward. He was wearing his pajamas. His chest had been completely shattered by the close-range shotgun blasts. He was dying. Ann collapsed to the floor in a state of absolute shock. When the police and medical examiners arrived moments later, they found a scene of total chaos. Ann was hysterical, sobbing, clinging to her husband's body, and repeating over and over, "I shot him. I thought he was a prowler. Oh God, I shot him." Billy Woodward was dead at 35. And Ann Woodward's nightmare was just beginning. The news of William Woodward Jr.'s death exploded across the world like a bomb. It was the ultimate tabloid sensation. Wealth, murder, high society, and a beautiful blonde showgirl turned wife. The police immediately launched an investigation. Detective chiefs questioned Ann, but she was so sedated by doctors, due to her hysterical state, that she could barely speak. To the detectives, the scene looked incredibly suspicious. Why hadn't she called out to her husband? How could she mistake her own husband for a burglar in a hallway she walked every day? Was it truly an accident? Or had Ann Woodward finally snapped after years of marital abuse and infidelity? But before the police could dig too deep, the immense power of the Woodward family stepped in. Elsie Woodward, the grieving mother who had just lost her only son, found herself facing her worst nightmare, a public, dirty, sensational murder trial that would drag the proud Woodward name through the mud. Elsie made a cold, calculated decision. She hated Ann. She believed in her heart that Ann had murdered her son, but Elsie loved her family's reputation more than she wanted revenge. Elsie threw the full weight of the Woodward fortune behind Ann. She hired the most expensive, well-connected defense attorneys in New York. She publicly issued a statement declaring that she fully believed Ann's story, that the shooting was a tragic accident. In November 1955, a Nassau County grand jury convened to determine if Ann Woodward should be indicted for murder. The proceedings were highly controlled. Ann testified in a black mourning dress, weeping as she recounted the horror of that night. And then, a stroke of incredible luck, or convenient timing, occurred. Just days before the grand jury made their decision, police arrested a man named Paul Worths. Worths admitted that he was the notorious Long Island prowler, and incredibly, he confessed that he had actually been on the Woodward estate on the night of October 30th, attempting to break in. That confession was the final nail in the investigation. The grand jury concluded that Ann had fired in genuine fear of an intruder. They voted not to indict her. Ann Woodward was officially a free woman. But the legal system is one thing, society is another. Ann had escaped prison, but she had not escaped punishment. Following the inquest, Elsie Woodward made good on her unspoken deal. She gave Ann a massive financial settlement, millions of dollars, and trust funds for her 2 sons. But in exchange, Ann was permanently exiled. New York society closed its doors to Ann Woodward forever. Her former friends stopped returning her calls. If she walked into an exclusive restaurant on Fifth Avenue, the room would fall silent, and patrons would turn their backs to her. They nicknamed her the Shooting Star. Unable to bear the suffocating judgment of New York, Anne fled to Europe. She became a wandering ghost of the international jet set. She lived in luxurious villas in Switzerland, Paris, and London. She took younger lovers, threw wild parties, and spent money recklessly. But those who knew her during this time described a woman who was deeply broken. She drank heavily. She was haunted by nightmares of the shooting. Her relationships with her two sons, William and James, became strained and distant as the boys grew up under the shadow of their father's violent death. Anne spent 20 years running from her past, but in 1975, her past finally caught up to her, and it arrived in the form of a man she thought was her friend. By the 1970s, Truman Capote was the most famous writer in America. Following the massive success of his true crime masterpiece, In Cold Blood, Capote had become the ultimate darling of New York high society. He was the confidant of the world's wealthiest women like Babe Paley, Slim Keith, and Lee Radziwill. He called them his swans. Capote listened to their deepest secrets, their marital woes, and their vicious gossip. And for years, Capote had been fascinated by the story of Ann Woodward. He had met her several times in Europe and New York. He listened to the whispers of the elite, who still insisted that Anne had murdered Billy Woodward in cold blood. Capote was working on what he promised would be his greatest masterpiece, a scandalous, explosive novel titled Answered Prayers. It was meant to be a thinly veiled exposé of the dark, corrupt lives of the ultra-wealthy. In the autumn of 1975, Esquire magazine published an excerpt from the upcoming book, a chapter titled La Côte Basque, 1965. The chapter was a nuclear bomb dropped on high society. In it, Capote revealed the dirty secrets of his wealthy friends, but he saved his most vicious venom for Ann Woodward. In the story, Capote created a character named Ann Hopkins, a vulgar social climbing showgirl who marries a wealthy blue blood aristocrat. Capote wrote, in excruciating detail, how Ann Hopkins caught her husband having an affair, realized he was going to divorce her, and decided to murder him. He wrote that she waited in the dark hallway with a shotgun, shot him dead, and successfully disguised the murder as an accident by blaming a neighborhood prowler. It was not fiction, it was an execution on paper. Advance copies of the Esquire magazine began circulating around New York in October 1975. Ann Woodward, now 60 years old and living quietly in her apartment on Fifth Avenue, learned about the story. She realized that Capote had laid her darkest secret bare for the entire world to read. She knew that the scandal, the humiliation, and the accusations were about to explode all over again. Her sons, who had tried so hard to build normal lives, would be humiliated. Anne could not face another trial by society. On October 10, 1975, almost exactly 20 years after the night she shot her husband Ann Woodward, lay down in her bed inside her Fifth Avenue apartment, she took a lethal dose of cyanide. When her body was discovered, the news shocked the city. But the ultimate eulogy for Ann Woodward came from her fiercest enemy. When told of Ann's suicide, Billy's aging mother, Elsie Woodward, reportedly said, "She shot my son, and Truman murdered her." The tragedy of Ann Woodward did not end with her death. The trauma of the shooting and the toxic weight of the Woodward fortune cast a dark, inescapable shadow over the next generation. In 1978, just 3 years after Ann's suicide, her younger son, James Woodward, jumped to his death from a hotel window in San Francisco. He was 29 years old. In 1999, her older son, William Woodward III, who had become a prominent publisher and philanthropist, jumped from the window of his Manhattan apartment, ending his life at the age of 54. The Woodward family, once a shining beacon of American aristocratic power, had been completely decimated by suicide, scandal, and tragedy. Today, the story of Ann Woodward remains a haunting cautionary tale. It is easy to look at her life and see a ruthless social climber who got what she deserved. But if you look closer, you see something much more complex. You see a woman born into a world of limited options, who used her beauty and ambition to build a fortress around herself, only to discover that the fortress was made of glass. Ann Woodward conquered the highest peaks of American society, but she could never conquer the prejudice of the people who ruled it. In the end, the immense wealth she fought so desperately to obtain didn't protect her, it destroyed her. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments below. Do you think Ann Woodward's shooting of her husband was a tragic accident, or the perfect murder? I'll see you next time with another deep dive into the fascinating, scandalous lives of elite women throughout history.